One thing was clear, that no enemy will ever even dream of threatening America's Navy. At 4:12 a.m. on November 14, 2025, the Caribbean was a black void, silent, empty, and hiding a mistake large enough to shake hemispheres. 5 Venezuelan fast attack boats, each no longer than 24 mer, but carrying enough firepower to punch 300 rounds per minute into a ship's hull, tore out of Punto Fijo in total radio silence. Their commanders believed a lone U.S. destroyer had drifted dangerously close to their waters. What they didn't know, what no one in Caracas realized, was that their radar grid was running 36 hours behind, misplacing American ships by nearly 500 nautical miles. And the destroyer they thought they were chasing, it wasn't a destroyer at all. It was the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a 100,000-ton nuclear carrier capable of launching 70 aircraft and delivering more firepower in an hour than Venezuela's entire navy could deliver in a week. 2 forces were closing distance in the dark, and they were only 7 seconds away from a war no one intended to start. Off the coast of Blanquilla Island, Caribbean Sea, when most of the Caribbean was still nothing but black water and wind, a Venezuelan naval alert flashed across the operations board in Punto Fijo. 5 fast attack boats, each barely 24 meters long, but carrying enough firepower to shred a coastal freighter, were ordered to depart immediately. Their mission sounded simple: intercept a lone American vessel approaching Bolivarian waters. But the simplicity was a lie, because the intel they were using was 36 hours out of date, pulled from a shore-based radar grid so old its calibration logs hadn't been updated since 2018. And in the Caribbean, a ship moving 20 knots can shift nearly 500 miles in that time. By the time the 5 boats punched through the harbor mouth, 3 armed with twin 12mm machine guns, 2 fitted with improvised 107mm rocket tubes. The Americans were nowhere near where Venezuela thought they were. The target wasn't a patrol destroyer slicing the sea alone. It was something else entirely. Something bigger, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous, far to the north, unknown to every officer aboard those Venezuelan boats. The USS Theodore Roosevelt, a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, had changed course at 2240 the previous night. That one maneuver, just 29 nautical miles of repositioning, created a deadly optical illusion on Venezuela's outdated radar map. And so 2 formations began sliding toward each other across the dark sea, guided by nothing but assumptions. No radio calls, no IFF signals, no updated charts. Just 5 Venezuelan captains convinced they were approaching a single American destroyer, and a U.S. carrier strike group that had no idea an armed squadron was speeding straight toward its bow. The ocean was quiet, too quiet for what was coming. By 4:58 a.m., the sea was still pitch black, but the calm had already fractured. 22 miles north of Blanquilla Island, the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt detected something impossible to ignore. 5 fast-moving contacts, each pushing 46 knots, coming straight up the carrier group's projected lane. They weren't fishing boats, they weren't merchant vessels, and no one closes distance at 46 knots unless they're trained or desperate. Inside the CIC, the Roosevelt's senior radar operator leaned in toward the screen. The data trail was unmistakable. Unknown surface group bearing steady, speed increasing. Within seconds, the call moved up the chain, and the carrier's captain uttered the sentence, "No sailor mistakes. Bring the escorts forward." Formation Delta 7, 2 U.S. destroyers, USS Laboon DDG-58 and USS Cole DDG-67, broke formation with surgical precision. Their engines surged from 14 to 28 knots, angling into a forward wedge designed to absorb the first hit of any surprise attack. Both ships carried more firepower than entire regional navies, each destroyer with 96 vertical launch cells, enough combined explosive yield to erase a small military base in under a minute. Above them, an MH-60R Seahawk lifted from the deck, rotors carving through the humid pre-dawn air. Within 70 seconds, it was at 500 feet, its infrared camera locking onto the surface, wakes of the approaching boats long, sharp, and growing brighter with every mile. From that altitude, the pilot could see what the Venezuelan captains could not. The Roosevelt's escorts shifting seamlessly into a defensive arc, a steel wall forming in the dark. Yet, no weapons fired, no warning sent. Just two forces drifting closer under the weight of assumptions, and the clock ticking faster than anyone realized. The Americans weren't looking for a fight, but the formation they were building meant they were ready for one. By 5:41, the shape of the confrontation was unmistakable. The Venezuelan squadron, 5 attack boats slicing white scars across the water, had closed the gap to 9 nautical miles. That distance, at their speed, meant less than 12 minutes before contact. But it wasn't the distance that set off alarms aboard the USS Laboon. It was the formation shift. Without warning, the Venezuelan boats split into 2 groups. 3 vessels darted north, angling directly toward Laboon's bow. 2 swung wide to the south, hugging the troughs of breaking waves to reduce their radar cross-section. That wasn't improvisation. That was doctrine-aggressive coastal swarm tactics taught to overwhelm larger warships. Inside the Roosevelt's Combat Information Center, the words were clinical, but heavy. Hostile pattern possible. Continue tracking. Above the dark sea, the Seahawk helicopter banked hard to starboard to keep all 5 boats in view. Its infrared camera showed something chilling. The heat signatures of weapons. 2 12.7mm machine guns glowing bright on each forward deck, and behind them, the distinctive thermal outline of 107mm surface-to-surface rocket tubes. Then came the moment that changed everything. The lead Venezuelan boat fired a single 107mm rocket into the water, not at the Americans, but ahead of its own bow. A show of force. A filmed warning shot for propaganda, but to a U.S. carrier strike group fully awake and on alert. A muzzle flash is not a performance. It is a threat. In that instant, the Roosevelt shifted to what every sailor fears Condition 1. Weapons free for self-defense. 5-inch guns unlocked. Ram launchers pivoted. CIWS barrels spun to 4,500 rounds per minute, ready to turn steel into dust. Meanwhile, the southern Venezuelan pair accelerated again, 48 knots, nearly their structural limit, attempting to flank the USS Cole. On radar, the maneuver looked alarmingly like a pincer designed to saturate defenses. The sea turned violent, spray rose like smoke, engines screamed, and then the moment nobody expected. One Venezuelan boat broke formation and surged forward, bow rising as it launched into a shallow chop. It's heading directly toward the USS Cole, range decreasing 1.8 nautical miles, 1.6, 1.4. At these speeds, America had 7 seconds before the boat reached the 1,000-yard trigger line for defensive fire. In the Seahawk's headset, the sensor operator's voice tightened. Target accelerating. No deviation. What followed next would determine whether the dawn broke with silence or with a war that no one wanted. But everyone was suddenly seconds away from starting. The next 24 minutes would later be described by U.S. Navy investigators as the closest pre-war engagement of the decade. But for the crew aboard the USS Cole, the moment was much simpler and far more terrifying. A hostile vessel was charging them at nearly 50 knots. At 6:03 a.m., the Venezuelan attack boat closed inside 1.3 nautical miles. That range, barely 400 yards, was where naval doctrine stops being caution and becomes instinct. Inside Cole's CIC, the tactical watch officer's voice was steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Mark the 1,000-yard line. Prepare countermeasures. On deck, sailors armed the ship's chaff launchers and warmed the laser designators. The ram turret rotated, tracking the incoming vessel with mechanical precision. Even its software seemed tense, its threat computer flashing the same warning on 3 separate screens. Fast mover closing. No course change. Above, the Seahawk helicopter dropped to 230 feet, holding a tight hover despite blasting wind shear. The pilot could clearly see the Venezuelan boat now, its bow punching through the chop, its gun crew bracing against the spray, its engine wake burning white behind it. And then came the sound that turned the Caribbean into a live wire. A metallic clack picked up by the Seahawk's camera microphone. The Venezuelan gunner had racked the charging handle on his deck-mounted 12.7mm machine gun. To a U.S. strike group, that single sound carries the same meaning as a trigger half pulled. The pilot called it in instantly. Cole, be advised, muzzle movement confirmed. Weapon hot. Inside the carrier strike group, the transition was immediate. Condition 1. Weapons release authorized. Cole's 5-inch gun slewed toward the waterline. Ram lock tone. The CIWS spun up to its terrifying blur 76 rounds per second, capable of vaporizing a fiberglass boat before the crew aboard even realized they'd been hit. The range counter kept falling. 900 yards, 850, 820, just 3 more seconds, and Cole would have no legal choice but to fire. Then, at 6:08 a.m., the impossible happened. The Venezuelan vessel suddenly veered hard to port, its hull tilting so steeply that the portside propeller briefly surfaced, screaming above the waterline. Spray exploded outward like smoke from a detonated charge. The boat skidded across its own wake, engines howling as it clawed away from Cole's bow. Behind it, the other 4 vessels broke off as well. Formation shattered. Momentum lost. The attack evaporating in real time. On U.S. radar screens, the hostile contacts that looked seconds from impact were now limping away at reduced speed. 45 knots down to 17, then 12. No rounds fired, no missiles launched. Just a razor-thin escape from the kind of mistake that starts wars, not videos. The danger wasn't gone. But the first breath of relief rolled through the strike group. Quiet, controlled, and temporary. At 8:01 a.m., just 3 minutes after the hammer's impact, the battlefield shifted in ways no Russian commander had predicted. Polivka Crossing Dam, once repurposed into a military highway, was no longer a structure. It was a wound. A 62-meter breach ripped through its center, expanding by the second as thousands of tons of water punched through the fractured concrete like a fist through glass. What had stood firm for 48 years collapsed in less than one. From above, Ukrainian drone operators watched the impossible unfold, the entire Russian supply artery dissolving into white water and debris. For 3 months, that dam had carried an estimated 118 vehicles every sunrise and more than 9,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts each week. Overnight, Russia had built an entire front line on the assumption this crossing would never fall. Now it was gone, within minutes. Russian logistics units began to unravel. Convoys approaching from the south were forced into emergency halts. Soldiers scrambled out of their trucks, staring at the churning void where their only shortcut across the river once stood. Traffic jammed backward for 11.3 kilometers. Freezing tanks, fuel trucks, and ammunition haulers in place. A single harm strike on that grid, Ukrainian analysts noted later, would have caused over $300 million in destroyed vehicles. But the chaos didn't stop there. Satellite feeds showed that the nearest alternative crossing lay 48 kilometers away, a route that doubled fuel requirements and tripled travel time. Russian artillery brigades near Lyman, which relied heavily on the Holivka route, saw their ammunition flow cut by up to 70% within the first 5 hours. By noon, 2 Russian battalions reported firing restrictions so severe that some guns were ordered to shoot only if directly attacked. For an army built on artillery dominance, that was catastrophic. Ukrainian forces, sensing weakness, moved immediately. By 2:15 p.m., reconnaissance teams advanced into previously unreachable pockets near the river. By evening, a mechanized Ukrainian company had regained 1.8 kilometers of ground terrain Russia had held for months. And in every headquarters tent, every operations hut, every armored vehicle command post, Russian officers were forced to ask the same question. How could a single bomb erase an entire front's backbone? The answer was simple and brutal. The moment Holivka Dam fell, the Russian supply line didn't just break. It collapsed all at once, like a bridge whose last bolt finally snapped. By 8:17 a.m., the shockwave from Holivka's destruction was no longer just a blast of water and shattered concrete. It was a political earthquake rolling straight into Moscow. What collapsed first wasn't a bridge or a battalion. It was the illusion of control. Inside the National Defense Management Center on Frunzenskaya Embankment, the morning briefing disintegrated in real time. Screens flashed red. Data feeds desynced. And within minutes, the generals knew something they desperately didn't want to say out loud. Russia had just lost the backbone of its northern Donetsk logistics because of a single Ukrainian jet built in 1983. The numbers alone were humiliating. Holivka Dam's collapse cut 47 kilos from their supply loop, forced 800 troops into emergency rationing, and stranded nearly 300 vehicles, including 5 T-72B3 tanks. On the wrong side of the river, satellite estimates later revealed that more than $190 million in fuel and ammunition became effectively unreachable in the first 2 hours. But the greater damage was political. Defense Minister Zolotov demanded to know why an S-400 regiment, Russia's pride of modern warfare, failed to stop a Soviet-era airframe. The commander of the 14th Air Defense Army blamed outdated software. The Buk Brigade commander blamed incorrect targeting behavior. The Tor M2 crew chief blamed electronic interference, likely supplied by NATO. Everyone blamed someone else. No one blamed the truth. Ukraine had outsmarted them in daylight. Inside the Kremlin, President Putin requested a private report. What he received instead was a list of failures so long it read like an autopsy. Among the findings, the Tor M2 battery fired at a decoy. The Buk M3 wasted $1 million missile on a bomb, and the S-400 required 3 recalculations in 9 seconds because the MiG pilot's maneuver was incompatible with predicted human behavior. That line leaked within hours. The Russian public didn't read it as unexpected. They read it as panic. By noon, Angry military bloggers demanded resignations. Pro-war pundits shouted about sabotage. And for the first time since the invasion began, a question surfaced on state-run forums faster than censors could delete it. If one Ukrainian pilot can humiliate 3 air defense systems, what does that say about everything else Moscow promised us? The Kremlin had no answer, because the truth was simple and devastating. Holivka didn't just break their supply line, it fractured their confidence. By 8-hour 45-8, as Russian commanders scrambled to contain the chaos on the ground, the story of Holivka's destruction was already racing across secure channels in Brussels, Washington, and London. The strike wasn't just a battlefield event anymore. It had become a geopolitical shock, something military planners would cite for years as proof that ingenuity can overpower hardware. At NATO headquarters, the first classified brief arrived under the code name Spring Torrent. Analysts stared at the footage, the vertical climb, the 5G dive, the glide bomb's thermal-guided descent, and one senior American officer reportedly said the quiet part out loud. This is the most precise, low-altitude strike we've seen in Europe since 1999. The numbers circulating were staggering. The collapse of Holivka instantly crippled 30% of Russian logistics in northern Donetsk. The delay in artillery transport reached 18 to 28 hours, an eternity in modern warfare. And within NATO circles, the political implication was obvious. Ukraine had proven it could break Russia's momentum without any new fighter jets or billion-dollar platforms. The Pentagon moved quickly. By 10-hour 30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Department of Defense released a statement praising Ukraine's exceptional tactical execution, though privately. American analysts were stunned by one detail. The entire mission was flown using a 42-year-old fighter jet with no stealth coating, no AESA radar, and no Western engine upgrades. In Brussels, EU ministers held an emergency video call. Reports of Russia forcing Ukrainian civilians to drive military supply trucks across the dam triggered immediate condemnation. The European Commission prepared a dossier to present before the UN Human Rights Council, documenting at least 137 cases of forced civilian labor in the Holivka sector alone. Meanwhile, global markets reacted. Russian defense stocks fell 11% in 1 hour. State media scrambled to downplay the event. But satellite imagery released by commercial providers made denial impossible. The dam was gone. The river had swallowed its remains, and backup routes were visibly clogged with immobilized convoys. Then came the diplomatic lightning strike. Canada, Poland, and the Baltic states called for new sanctions targeting Russian logistics officers involved in the use of civilian drivers. Britain's Foreign Secretary warned that Holivka may mark a turning point in Moscow's ability to sustain offensive operations. Across the Atlantic, American viewers, over 60 many with memories of the Cold War, heard the same unmistakable message. Ukraine had just rewritten the rules of asymmetric warfare. By 11-hour 20 mere hours after the dam's collapse, the story shifted again, this time from military brilliance to something darker, something far more uncomfortable for Moscow to explain. As Ukrainian rescue units and investigative teams reached the Holivka Basin, the truth that had been whispered for weeks finally emerged into daylight. Russia had not merely used the dam as a supply bridge, it had used Ukrainian civilians as expendable human freight. Evidence came fast, and in quantities too large to hide. The first shock was the discovery of 42 abandoned civilian cargo trucks, all marked with hastily painted military numbers. Inside, investigators found personal belongings, Children's drawings, a shopping list, a set of house keys items no soldier would carry into combat. Many trucks still had their original registration documents, proving that they had been confiscated from Ukrainian families in the occupied zones. Then came the testimonies, one by one. Shaken survivors stepped forward. A mechanic from Rubizhne recounted being forced to drive ammunition crates for 11 hours a day under threat of losing his family. A 62-year-old schoolteacher described how soldiers took her nephew's truck and offered him two choices: drive for the army or disappear. Another man revealed he had crossed Holivka Dam 23 times in 2 months, always hauling rocket munitions with a Russian soldier walking behind him. Rifle pointed at his spine. The numbers were damning. Ukrainian officials logged 137 documented cases of forced civilian labor in the Holivka sector alone, and estimated the real figure could exceed 300. Satellite images corroborated survivor accounts, showing long columns of trucks with mixed civilian and military plates. International law experts immediately recognized the pattern. Under Articles 48 and 51 of the Geneva Conventions, using civilians to shield military assets is classified not merely as a violation, it is a war crime. That afternoon, the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission released a preliminary statement calling Russia's actions a systematic attempt to conceal military logistics within protected civilian infrastructure. Amnesty International echoed the accusation, labeling the practice deliberate exploitation. In Kyiv, one investigator summarized it bluntly. Holivka was never just a bridge, it was a trap. And the people inside those trucks were the bait. With the dam gone, the water exposed more than a supply route. It exposed a crime the world could no longer ignore. By 1 hour 30 fums, as the river continued swallowing the ruins of Holivka Dam, military analysts from Warsaw to Washington were already recalculating the battlefield. What happened that morning was no longer viewed as a successful Ukrainian strike. It was being discussed as a strategic pivot, the kind of moment that forces entire armies and entire governments to rethink the war they thought they were fighting. The numbers alone told a story of collapse. Russian artillery output in the northern Donetsk sector dropped by 61% within the first 12 hours. The 74th Motorized Brigade reported artillery shortages so severe that 2 battalions were instructed to fire only under emergency conditions. Logistics officers warned that fuel deliveries would now take 3 times longer, pushing armored units into what one leaked memo called operational paralysis. But the wider consequences were political and far more enduring. Inside the Kremlin, the strike shattered a narrative that Moscow had carefully constructed for 2 years, that Russia's logistics were stable, secure, and untouchable. Holivka proved the opposite. It showed that a single weak link, one dam, one crossing, one overlooked civilian exploitation scheme could bring an entire sector to its knees. The Russian public saw satellite images of the destroyed crossing and began asking a dangerous question. If this was so vital, why wasn't it protected? State media struggled to answer. Even harder to explain was the growing anger inside Russia's own military blogging community. Several prominent pro-war channels, usually Kremlin-friendly, turned openly hostile. One wrote, "Holivka is what happens when corruption replaces competence." Another said, "We lost a front line because generals were too busy lying upward." Meanwhile, Ukraine's allies interpreted the event through a different lens. For the United States, the strike validated a key Pentagon theory that Russia's war machine is far more fragile than it claims, built on vulnerable logistics networks rather than deep strategic planning. For European nations weary of funding the war, Holivka became the proof that support yields results, not in years, but in hours. Military aid discussions that had stalled suddenly accelerated. But perhaps the most profound impact lay in the message the strike delivered to both sides. To Ukraine, precision, courage, and intelligence can overcome scale. To Russia, even a giant can stumble if it rests on brittle foundations. Holivka wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a reminder that in modern war, the decisive blow is often the one no one expects until it's already fallen. By 4:00 p.m., as the battlefield quieted and analysts finished their maps and briefings, one truth lingered above the churned-up river and shattered concrete. Holivka was never just about a dam. It was about a choice, one that defined the difference between an army fighting for survival and an army fighting through coercion, denial, and fear. For Ukraine, the strike became a symbol of something larger than tactics. It represented a line the nation refused to cross: never harm civilians. Even when the enemy hides behind them, the pilot risked his life to wait for a 4-minute window with no civilian trucks. He chose precision over revenge, restraint over rage, humanity over expediency. Russia chose the opposite. It turned a civilian structure into a military artery. It forced ordinary Ukrainians to carry munitions across a dam now lying at the bottom of the river. It gambled that the world wouldn't notice. But the world did. Nations condemned the exploitation. Human rights groups demanded accountability. And for viewers, especially those old enough to remember other wars, other injustices, Holivka became a quiet reminder of the oldest truth in conflict. A battlefield is not measured only in territory gained or lost, but in the moral lines nations choose to honor or to break. The dam fell, but the lesson rose.